Proceeding will start shortly. The proceeding will start shortly. The proceeding will start shortly.
Order, order. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Nick Fletcher to move the motion.
Thank you, Sir Roger, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 580220 relating to the legal recognition of non-binary gender identities. I first want to thank Ezio, who started this petition. I met Ezio and had a good conversation on this subject. It has gained over 140,000 signatures and is therefore a topic that is on many people's minds. Many people I spoke to said they supported this petition as they felt at present that they don't exist. But I want this community of people who do feel non-binary to know that of course I accept that they do exist. I see them, I hear them, I feel for them, and I want to help them. I say this to them: we are a tolerant nation and we accept you as you are. However, it does not follow that the law has to be changed to reflect the way certain individuals feel. And so I want to start by saying that no matter where anyone sits on this subject, their opinion should be respected. I have not taken part in any social media discourse on this subject, as I often believe it turns completely negative, and having met some people who are suffering with gender dysphoria, I do not think that helps them in any way whatsoever. We must always remember that we are talking about human lives, people, indeed people we share society with. I have spoken with many persons on this subject and I thank them all for their contribution. Let me start with what the petition asks for: to have non-binary be included as an option under GRP, Gender Recognition Panel, GRC, Gender Recognition Certificate, in order to allow those identifying as non-binary to be legally seen as their true gender identity, as well as having non-binary seen as a valid transgender identity. By recognising non-binary as a valid gender identity, it would aid in the protection of non-binary individuals against transphobic hate crimes and would ease gender dysphoria experienced by non-binary people. This may seem straightforward. It's just an extra column on a birth certificate or gender recognition certificate. It's just on forms that we complete on a daily basis. We have the Gender Recognition Act in place already, so why not? Whether our starting position is whether we agree with this or not, we need to look at the impact and implications it will cause to wider society. Let me walk you through my reservations. Firstly, I don't believe it will necessarily help with gender dysphoria. If they think they can only exist with an X in a box, then we as a society need to convince them differently. I have spoken with many people in this community prior to this debate, and they certainly spoke well. I really don't think any of these people need a mark in a box to exist. Secondly, I don't think it will reduce any so-called hate crimes. People who carry out these sorts of offences have no place in a free society, but we already have criminal laws in place to deal with such appalling behaviour already. There are then practical issues concerning both non-binary and the trans question. They are protecting our kids from life-changing decisions before they are adults and old enough to make such decisions, single-sex spaces, and of course, sport. Let me start with children. There are clusters appearing in certain areas of the country where school children are saying they are non-binary or trans. My questions are, where did this come from? Why is it more prevalent in some areas than others? Who or what is putting this idea in young minds? Who is telling them you can be the opposite of what you are? I will.
very grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way, and I'm very grateful for the comments he made earlier about respectful tone, and I'm sure that we can all agree with that. What I don't agree with is the notion that it's necessarily the case that someone has put an idea into people's minds about their own identity, and I wonder if the Honourable Gentleman can maybe reflect on that as he goes forward.
I thank my honourable member for her comments, and I will reflect on that later as we go through this speech. But I do think that this is something that is exponentially growing at this moment in time, and I am deeply concerned about it. I don't want to get too technical on this, but there are certain times in our life when certain areas develop. The first 2 years can be crucial with the development of the front part of our brain. The same can be said with our nerve endings on our eyes. If these don't join properly by the time we are 4 or 5, they never will. Puberty is also such a developmental time, and many young people are now questioning their gender at this crucial time. If we stop this developmental process in its tracks before puberty, then the results can be life-changing. I believe making non-binary a legal identity and an acceptance that this is an easy path to take will have hugely detrimental effects on many young people when I know as a certain fact that they are not old or mature enough to make that decision and understand the long-term and life-changing consequences. They are children, they are not adults. Therefore, any such decisions for children below the age of 18 must be avoided. I am also unsure who is to decide that this child is not a boy or a girl and when. The child can't when it's born, so who decides? Doctors have always decided the biological sex, and there are rules in place for that. And what about a 10-year-old? Can a child decide then, or is it still a parental choice? All the time, one of the few consistencies a person can have in this mixed-up world is taken away. Is society really to say that he or she cannot decide whether they are a boy or a girl, or feel they are before they have gone through puberty? The interim cash report said we are letting our young people down by not having enough centres for kids who believe they are suffering from gender dysphoria. There are those who disagree. I have heard from a senior mental health specialist that the lack of appointments is actually saving us from a tsunami. This specialist is not alone in that view. So maybe clinics are not the answer. Maybe they are. Maybe education is. Maybe a standard curriculum, a single piece on what this looks like practically. Just basics. This is what a life can look like and how it can never be changed once medication starts. Let us educate our parents too, not just to say yes to keep the peace, but to be strong and get our kids on the right path. Give our teachers the ability to say no to this issue at school. They want to. They want to teach kids and they want to watch them shine, not fall apart. And please let us stop with these blurring of lines and bending on every whim that a lobby group asks for. Let's ask ourselves why a lobby group wants to work in this space. Why do they want to put kids even as young as 10 onto puberty blockers? Especially when they know that most that do take puberty blockers end up on further drugs leading to infertility, facial hair for girls, and in a place where no one else is. It's been said that people are taking their own lives because they are so confused prior to treatment. But these struggling individuals are taking their own lives after treatment too, so that really is no answer. We have to protect our children whilst they are children. The next problem is what happens in single-sex spaces. This is deeply concerning. If we are to work around it to make it work safely for women, which I believe will be imperative, the necessary changes to our buildings would cost billions of pounds. Why should a female prisoner have to share a prison with a man who identifies as non-binary or trans person? Why should a lady have to share a changing room with a man? Why should a woman have to follow a pre-op trans woman into a toilet cubicle? Why should a girl at school have to get changed in front of a boy? Why should a girl have to share a dorm with a boy? Whether the girl thinks it's okay or not, I'm sure their mums and dads don't. I don't believe it's safe, I don't believe it's decent, and I don't believe it's right. Women are not only entitled to safe single-sex spaces, they are also absolutely necessary. Society has been this way for centuries. It works, and it should not be casually put aside. Sport. I'm not the greatest sports person that has ever lived. I never have been, but I do understand competition, the feeling of winning, wanting to strive to be the best. I speak in schools whenever I get the chance. I encourage all children to aim high in life and not be frightened of competition. Am I to tell the girls in the school, don't bother competing? You'll never stand on that podium at the highest level. The best you can hope for is second when you compete against a trans woman. Everyone will know you've won, but I'm afraid that gold medal is forever out of your reach. That is wrong. Biology matters and biological sex is real. Men and women are built differently from birth and remain different throughout their lives. To pretend otherwise is to ignore reality. So to make non-binary a legal entity reaches beyond what many people can think of, and that is why I can't support this petition. Now, am I being unfair? I don't think so. I'm being what I hope is realistic. The vast majority of people in my constituency know that men and women exist and that they are different, male and female. There may be people who feel their gender is non-binary, but they are all biological men and women. So what is my response to this genuine concerns behind this position? My first ask is leave our kids alone. Kids have enough to cope with as it is. Let them decide when they are old enough and mature enough to make these decisions. I hear so much of complex families and complex lives. Let's not make them any more complex. For sure, that would be unwise. And while I'm here, I want to speak to parents. If your child comes home with these concerns, talk to them, but be strong. Do not ever give in to them or to peer pressure from other adults. Your child was born a boy or a girl. Be proud of who they are. Tell them to be proud of who they are. Wherever their interests lie, help and encourage them. Be part of their life. Talk to them. Talk to them all the time. But push back on this. Sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind. They will thank you for it in the long run. And just one further thought on this. If they say they are unhappy, think just for a second how unhappy they will be when their best friend is having a child and they can't. When their best friends are dressing up beautifully and they're having to shave. What makes you sure they will be happy then? Single-sex spaces are exactly that, and they should stay that way. When an individual enters one of these spaces, their sex is what should matter, not their assumed gender or how they feel that given day. To endanger women, or even just to make them feel uncomfortable, is not fair. Some surveys have been reportedly carried out showing people are okay with this. But who have they asked? Where have they asked? What were the questions and how were they phrased? Have they knocked on the doors in my constituency? I know people there, and I know they agree with me. And as for sport, well, again, it's just not right. Certain sports, like rugby, may carry out risk assessments, and this will exonerate them from joining this argument. But please, shout up. Sport is sport, and if it's not fair, well, it ain't right. I ask the biggest voices in the arena, the sportsmen and women at the top of their game, the pundits, you've earned your money from the public. You say you want to give back. Well, don't blow in the wind. Use your position on this subject and truly give back. Give back every child a chance to have a great childhood and to dream big like you did. Speak as one voice and push back. I have read many books of late on this subject. I have spent much time trying to see a different side to this. But ruining young lives, making women feel unsafe and taking away sporting ambitions of half the population just isn't right. Just one final argument. I have heard that this is what other countries have done, and therefore so should we. Well, I don't represent another country. I represent this one. I believe by far the best. So don't tell me England is a bad place. It's not. It has issues like all other countries do, but I truly believe it's absolutely wonderful. We should never do something because another country does. We should do something because it's right. So I'm afraid I cannot back a movement that may rob a child of their life. I can never back a community who wants to put a biological male in a female's changing room. And I will never back anyone who wants to put a biological male in a female sports event, whether it be at Wimbledon or on a school field. And in all fairness, I don't think any of us should. Now, I may have come across quite strong. I feel I have to. I started by saying at the beginning that I want this community who feel non-binary to know that, of course, I accept that they do exist. I see them, I hear them, I feel for them, and I want to help them. I say this to them. We are a tolerant nation, and we accept you as you are. And at 18, we should be able to give you a person to talk to, someone who can help, and this we must. And anyone who abuses this community needs taken to task, and if an offence is committed, then they should be prosecuted. But I'm afraid this course of life that a small minority wish to embrace comes with far-reaching implications to the rest of society, and as such, I'm afraid I cannot support. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 580220 relating to legal recognition of non-binary gender identities. Miriam Cates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Non-binary is a term for gender identities that are not solely male or female, identities that are outside the gender binary. So what do we mean by gender? Well, the word gender used to be interchangeable with biological sex, and biological sex is indeed binary. Humans, as all mammals, have either male or female sex chromosomes in every cell. We are male or female. That is immutable, and it's scientifically indisputable. So what is gender identity? Well, gender is sometimes used as a descriptor of how masculine or feminine something is perceived to be, a particular character trait, a choice of clothing, a type of behaviour. We all understand what feminine or masculine clothes look like, though of course these stereotypes change between cultures and over time. Certain preferences are considered to be more masculine or feminine, and certain characteristics are more common in males or females. But we all know both males and females who possess these traits. And given how important one's sex is to our biology and our psychology, it would be very odd indeed if our sex didn't have some influence over our choices and behaviour. So what is the evidence for the idea that someone could have a gender identity that is different to their biological sex? The idea that you can be male but feel female, or in the case of non-binary, that you can be either male or female but feel neither or both. Now, it's absolutely normal for an individual to feel that they don't fit in with cultural or stereotypical ideas of how boys or girls, men or women should behave. How many of us in this room feel like we fit into a purely male or female or any other stereotype? No one fits completely neatly into a mould, and some people feel that they don't fit at all. So of course it's possible for someone to feel that they identify in some ways more with people of the opposite sex than their own, or not particularly with either. This is a normal part of the human experience. But whilst there are infinite different ways to express masculinity and femininity, it doesn't follow, logically or scientifically, that your soul or self has a gender, or that that gender is distinct from your biological sex. There's no observable marker for what it feels like to be female or male, because no one knows what it feels like to be anyone other than ourselves. And if we see a person's likes or dislikes, preferences and behaviours only through the lens of gender, then we've lost sight of a concept far more important and evidence-based, the variety of human personality. Through the wonder of DNA and the infinite permutations of upbringing and environment, every one of us has a unique personality. But those who see everything through the lens of gender are watching humanity in black and white, rather than through the glorious technicolor of the richness and variety of human nature. And in trying to squeeze all that human diversity into the box of gender, there's also a danger of losing a grip on material reality. Now, some people struggle intensely with gender distress, some from a very early age, and they should be treated with the utmost compassion and care and receive all the care and support and treatment they require. Adults should, of course, in this country be free to dress and present in any way without fear or discrimination and fully accepted. But in this country, our law is based on facts and evidence and material reality. It shouldn't be used to embed contested and unevidenced ideologies that can sometimes be harmful. And I will explain why I do believe this ideology is so harmful. Children are now being taught in schools that there are more than two genders, that they can change their gender. They are being told by trusted adults that if they are gender non-conforming, itself a regressive concept that we threw out in the 1980s, then that might mean they were born in the wrong body. In one classroom, children are being taught the facts of sexual reproduction, and in another, that women can have penises and men can have periods. They're being told to suppress the evidence of their own eyes by saying that a boy is now a girl is now a boy, or neither boy nor girl. Vulnerable children, those particularly who are autistic, same-sex attracted, or have other mental health conditions, latch on to gender theory as an explanation of why they might be different, why they don't fit in. These children then look up trans and non-binary online. They're drawn in by adults they don't know on Discord and TikTok who tell them how to obtain and inject cross-sex hormones. They follow YouTube stars who glorify surgical transition. Schools jump into transitioning children, changing their names and their pronouns, celebrating their new gender status publicly, sometimes without informing their parents, cutting them off from the people who care about them most. There has been a 15-fold increase in children referred to gender clinics and an exponential rise in the number of trans and non-binary identified children in school. And let's remember the ultimate consequences of transition: infertility, loss of sexual function for life. For girls, permanent facial hair, a deep voice, male pattern baldness, and lifelong health problems. This is a failure of safeguarding. It's not biology, it's ideology, and in many cases, it's indoctrination. It's not open-minded or compassionate to teach a child that they may be trans or non-binary. It's not open-minded or compassionate to encourage a child to look up gender on the internet and to talk to adults who ask them intimate questions and for intimate pictures. It's not open-minded or compassionate to tell a child that their teenage problems can be solved overnight by a rejection of their own body and a denial of their biological sex. We need to wake up. Gender theory is not the next frontier in the culture war or a new battle for civil rights. It's an unevidenced ideology that is causing harm to women, to children, and to people who are gay and lesbian. There is a significant amount of work to do to fix the safeguarding failures that are taking place in some schools, and I'm delighted that my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, is aware of some of these issues. But to recognise non-binary as a gender identity in statute would be a mistake, separating law from reality and putting vulnerable children at risk. But I do want to echo the comments of my honourable friend from Don Valley. This is a debate about people, and I fully recognise that there are many people in this country who do identify as non-binary and should absolutely be accepted. But this is a matter of putting ideology into law, and we should resist that.
Sir Roger, thank you very much. I want to make a few brief words in this debate, but given we've got a little time, I might add a few more. I want to start by echoing the words of my honourable friend who proposed the petition, in that absolutely we have a duty to be tolerant of those who do not identify with their gender which reflects their biological sex, or those who choose to identify as non-binary. And I acknowledge there are a great many people, young people, suffering from gender dysphoria, and we need to be supportive and give them the help that they require. That doesn't mean we have to change the law. And it certainly doesn't mean that we have to change the statute in order to recognise one particular description of how people are choosing to identify. And as my honourable friend said earlier, there are criminal laws in place to deal with transphobic crime and other related hate crime, and it's important that those laws are enforced and are seen to be enforced in no different a way to the law is enforced against those who do not identify in that way. The petition says that by recognising non-binary as a valid gender identity, it would aid in the protection of non-binary individuals against transphobic hate crimes and would ease gender dysphoria experienced by non-binary people. That's quite a bold claim on which I do not see the evidence, Sir Roger. Indeed, faced with the possibility of identifying not as a male, not as a female, but as non-binary, could cause added confusion, certainly to teenagers going through a very formative and impressionable stage of their lives, as if they haven't got enough to worry about already. We hear in so many debates, Sir Roger, about the huge pressures on our teenagers. Those of us who parents have seen it ourselves. They certainly have far more pressures than when you and even I were at school or growing up, going through puberty and everything related to it, Sir Roger. But the mental health impact of the modern world, of social media, of the peer pressure, of the trendy thing to to do that goes on in the school and, crucially, in the social media world out of the range of face-to-face challenge. These are huge pressures on our young people today. And now to face them with, are you sure you're a girl or a boy? What are they to do? Putting that into law that says, actually, you may not be a girl or a boy, you can opt for non-binary. And the pressure from some people to get their contemporaries to do that could be overwhelming, whether or not that person, young person, instigates it themselves. So I take issue with the formation of this, the formula of this petition, because I think it could actually make things worse for those children who are already potentially questioning their gender identity because of pressures on them. But by not acknowledging that the law needs to be changed in order to protect such individuals should not be seen as in some way being anti-transgender or anti those people who want to identify themselves as different to the sex with which they were born. And I've shared the concerns of my honourable friend from Sheffield just now about the disproportionate number of young people in particular who are looking to identify as transgender or non-binary and ending up in gender clinics, a 15 times increase in recent years that my honourable friend just mentions. And why is there this big increase? We need more evidence. We need more research on exactly what is driving this and what's driving it in certain parts of the country or certain parts of the world as well. Now, I gather that it's heretical to claim that you cannot change your birth sex. But to me, I mean, it's not terribly traditional to have been brought up in biology lessons, which says that sex is immutable. I fully acknowledge that people can choose to change their gender and want to be identified as something else. They cannot reverse history and reverse or change their birth sex. You can only choose to change your gender or the way that you are recognised now. You can't go back in time. And we must also look at the impact on the rest of the population. It is absolutely right that we protect a minority of people who need protections, but it is not right that we do it with no regard whatsoever to the vast majority of the population who do identify as men and women, and particular women the impact on women's space is absolutely worrying. And again, we've heard examples about gender-neutral toilets, changing rooms, the situation in prisons, and so on. There's also... I will.
It's given way. And I wonder if he is able to go into some more detail about his concerns regarding prisons. And I say that having heard the Minister on numerous occasions clarify the arrangements for making sure that everyone ought to be safe on the prison estates.
Indeed, everybody should be safe in prisons, and I've raised it with the Prisons Minister in the past, and there are statistics, I'm afraid, that shows that there have been sexual assaults committed in a prison by somebody whose gender is different to their biological sex. Now, I know and appreciate that the government is doing more to make sure that that cannot happen in the future, but I'm afraid there are cases that that has happened, and that's why women in particular feel threatened, because they are in it. The Honourable Lady may well not feel threatened, but a lot of my constituents have come to me, seeing this evolving argument, to say that there are places where they no longer feel safe. And we have a duty of care to those people and their safety and well-being as well. And frankly, anybody who has the audacity to question any of these things, as I just has, is faced with the cancel culture, which is so utterly damaging and absolutely doesn't help the population as a whole. And it certainly doesn't help women. It doesn't help the gay and lesbian population as well, who feel greatly restricted by much of this. So this argument and this terminology in this petition, I'm afraid, is about the creeping blurring of language and a conflation of and around sex and gender. and that just threatens to raise the recognition of males and females, of men and women. And as I said, I'm particularly concerned about the impact on children. I've been in Parliament for quite a while, not quite as long as you, Sir Roger, but in that time, most things have been more restricted to children. More things, we've seen the age of access raised to 18. You can no longer go into a sun tanning parlour if you are under 18 to get a suntan. You can no longer have a tattoo unless you're under the age of 18. We quite rightly restrict cosmetic procedures unless medically required for children, and we know the pressures on young girls to get breast enlargement surgery in order to, be with the programme and all the social media pressures that they get about men to have first cosmetic surgery as well. So it seems extraordinary to me, against that trend of recognising that children are children, and when they're adults they can do what they like within reason if it doesn't harm anybody else, but children need our protection, and that's why the laws are there. And yet we have seen this huge increase in access to puberty blockers through gender clinics, which, as my honourable friend for Sheffield has quite rightly said, have life-changing impacts on those children, far more than a tattoo or a temporary suntan or even a breast enlargement operation would have. And yet, if you challenge that, if you question whether those children are actually capable of thinking through the consequences and cognizant of the implications for the rest of their lives to make that decision with or without parental responsibility being involved, then you're subject to cancel culture. And there is just a huge contradiction, I think, in those two scenarios. And let me end, Sir Roger, on examples in Parliament as well, because what we do here, whether we like it or not, is seen outside and is seen as setting an example. Sometimes it's a bad example, but certainly what we do and what we say in this place has influences. Well, you may have seen the reports of the debate a few days ago in the House of Lords about the maternity, ministerial and other maternity allowances bill, where there were attempts to erase the term woman from that bill. And I'm glad that my honourable friend, the Baroness Noakes, led the resistance to that, and she said, I am not prepared to be erased as a woman, because effectively that is what was happening there. And the language you use in this place is important. And I talked about the creeping blurring of language. You may recall, Sir Roger, that 3 years ago I was successful in my private member's bill, now the Civil Partnerships, Marriages and Deaths Registration, etc. Act, which enabled opposite-sex couples to have a civil partnership, enabled the mothers of married couples to have their names on marriage certificates, and also brought in various requirements for stillbirths. Unbeknownst to me, and only pointed out sometime after that legislation went through both Houses of Parliament, in Clause 3, it refers to persons who are pregnant. Not women, but persons who are pregnant. If I had known that that had been inserted, I didn't write those words, it was written by civil servants in one of the departments, I would have insisted that language is going to be changed. Indeed, at the first opportunity, perhaps in the conversion theory legislation coming through, I will be proposing an amendment to my own act to make sure that we refer to women, because it's only women who can get pregnant. This is happening all the time, and it's this language, this is insidious changes and blurring of our language that is so important. And another thing has just come to notice, Sir Roger, as well. If you are looking for a fellow member on the Houses of Parliament search engine, or one of your constituents is doing so, and you're not quite sure where they come from, what the subject is, but you want to search by sex, you now have 4 options. You can say that they're male, they're female, they're any, or they're non-binary. That is on the search engine of this House, and yet the term non-binary, as we've heard, does not have any status in legislation. Indeed, that's what this petition is all about. We are setting the trend by acknowledging the existence of a formal term of non-binary in searching for members of Parliament, either of this House or of the Lords. And I'm not aware that any member of the Lords or Commons has in any case identified as non-binary. That is what I'm worried about, Sir Roger. Words matter. And although this petition, well, I'm going to, I think, give over to the front benches because we are going to run out of time, and I have been generous to the Honourable Lady. Words matter. And if we don't set a good example in this place, if we allow the blurring of terms and language to go unchallenged and unnoticed, then don't be surprised when we see the consequences, some of which my honourable friends have alluded to. And finally, Lord Winston, from the noble Lord Winston from the Upper House, has also written extensively, a man of huge expertise and knowledge and respect for his scientific and medical background. And he talks about badly damaged children who've been subjected to the puberty blocking and other gender treatments at gender clinics that they've had. We have a duty to young people. We have a duty to our constituents to make sure that words matter and to make sure that protections matter and that respect matter. And that's why, with the best intentions I'm sure this petition has, I think it would have great implications if it were to be adopted by government, and I urge the Minister to desist from doing so.
Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you very much, Sir Roger, and it's a pleasure to participate in this debate today, which I think is a very important one, and I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for Don Valley in opening this, and I think reflecting that people have told him that they felt that they don't exist. And I think that that's a sentiment that we should reflect upon as we go through this debate. There have been 189 signatures on this petition from East Renfrewshire, and I'm grateful to those people for signing, and I'm grateful to those who have taken the time to speak to me and share their views. I'm also grateful to a number of organisations who've provided briefing materials for today. But I think we need to get to the crux of this. What are we talking about and why does it matter? The Honourable Member for Don Valley and I'm sure he'll take this in the positive spirit that's intended. We don't have a lot in common, I suspect, in terms of our outlook and views, and he's shaking his head. So he agrees with me there. But I did really support what he said about the importance of tone in the discussion. I'm not sure that anybody who was concerned with this on a personal level would be particularly comfortable having heard the debate today, but I absolutely support his calls for a proper tone to be adopted. And I think he also spoke about listening being important, and I think that we do have to not only listen, but to actually take in what we're being told. So it's very welcome that we have this debate today. I think these kind of conversations are well overdue, because we should be, in my view, on a journey to a situation where it's an absolutely normal and unremarkable thing to accept people for who they are. We shouldn't have to hear othering comments. We shouldn't hear portrayals of non-binary people as a threat. That's neither fair nor helpful nor accurate. And I'm uncomfortable with the notion that was expressed by the Honourable Member for Penistone and Stockbridge that this is something we should consider in the context of it being a medical complaint or a concern that is related to people who are neurodiverse, for instance. And I'm delighted to give you.
Thank you for letting me intervene. But the evidence is pretty clear that a disproportionate number of children who identify as trans and non-binary are autistic, have been diagnosed as autistic, and many more are awaiting diagnosis. There is a very clear link between children who are neurodiverse and children who are choosing to go down this path. Does she not think that that in itself is of a concern, and that those children should be surrounded with safeguarding support?
I think that all children should be surrounded with safeguarding and support, and I suspect that that is something that she and I can agree on. But I think to conflate autism diagnosis and people who are non-binary is a mistake, and I think unhelpful in this bigger picture. I also didn't agree with the assertion that the Honourable Member for East Worthington and Shoreham, I beg your pardon, I'm glad he's able to correct me on that, I can't read my own writing, that there's some kind of issue with, for instance, something like non-binary appearing on a drop-down menu. that shouldn't be an issue for any of us. That costs us absolutely nothing, and it makes people feel more comfortable. And he said himself, if I can make some progress, then I'll be delighted for him to come in. He said himself that words matter and we need to set a good example in this place. That was what he said. He said that there are no MPs or peers who are non-binary. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily true, but again, I wonder if there were MPs or peers who identified as non-binary, how they would feel in this room today and how comfortable they would be with the statements that their peers had made. And I just put that back to those who've contributed. I suspect that they may feel quite uncomfortable. And if the honourable gentleman wants to come in, I'm delighted to take his intervention.
Thank you for letting me intervene on this. It's the implications. Most of my speech was built around the fact that if we give this as a way forward for people to go to, what will follow on from this will change society as a whole. So it may just be a drop-down menu to the honourable member, but to me it could change the way that young people grow up, the way that women identify themselves. Basically, as we said, we will erase women. And it will also have a huge effect on the sports scene as well. So it may just be a drop-down menu to the honourable member, but it's certainly not to me.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for intervening there. I have to say to him, I'm a woman, I'm not going to be erased, and other people having the opportunity to have their identity respected is absolutely no threat to me and no threat to my identity. I did wonder if it was worth maybe going back to the principles of this. Who are we talking about? Who are non-binary people? The honourable gentleman used they a few times in his debate, and he may have a very clear picture of who he's referring to, but people who are listening or watching may not. And I thought it would be useful to just reflect that non-binary people, that statement reflects an incredibly diverse group of people, people who are undergoing various forms of social and medical transitions, or none at all, and not all of the people whose views, lives, concerns are reflected here today might even use the term non-binary themselves to describe themselves. So it's quite a broad range of people who we're talking about. But one thing that we can be sure of is that that group of people is a group which is not currently recognised in the UK. And that does present them with some challenges. There can be barriers because there is not that legal recognition available to them. So if they have a piece of identity documentation, as we all do, then that piece of documentation may present differently to the way that they present in their day-to-day lives. And I think all of us can understand that that might present a challenge. I think, if you imagine joining a new workplace and presenting the piece of identity documentation, that would be a pretty concerning situation for you if you felt that that didn't reflect your daily life. And, I don't think that we all have to agree on all of the things that have been expressed today to see that that kind of thing is a challenge and that maybe we can find a better way. And I think that society in general is moving on this. We've heard a lot about young people. I know that the young people who I speak to have got a much broader and more open perspective on issues like this than was being the case many decades ago when I was at school. But then if I reflect on the situation when I was at school, there was a real difficult climate in terms of LGBT people. There were no gay children in my school. It was a very large school, but nobody there was gay. Of course, that's complete nonsense, as I now know. Lots and lots of people, in fact, are gay, but it wouldn't have been okay for them, and there was nothing wrong with the school. The climate in society wouldn't have been accepting of that. And I think that that's a reflection of how we have moved on, and I think we're moving on further. I think that business is more open to this. I think that civic society is more open to the fact that we do need to accommodate the needs of non-binary people, whether that's in employment, in service provision, or whatever. And the fact that there isn't the ability to have this conversation, never mind legal recognition, but actually to have the conversation about the barriers, I think sometimes is a challenge. And I understand that 78% of non-binary people have told Transaction that they do not have identification documents, and that's a real challenge to them. How on earth do people go about their lives without having identification documents that align with your lived experience? How is that going to affect you socially, never mind in terms of things like employment? And there are other countries which have moved further forward, and the honourable gentleman reflected that himself in what he said. I appreciate that I think he said that, England is the best country and he, supports the way things are done you know, that's absolutely your perspective, his perspective, I beg your pardon. But I think it's sensible for us to look at the fact that in other countries, in other places around the world, there is a different perspective, and, you know, perhaps examine why that would be the case and whether it has caused difficulties. And I have to tell you that it does not appear to be challenging in places like India, Nepal, New Zealand, Iceland, Taiwan. I could go on, but won't further to be a different and more open way of recording these things. And I think that if we're looking at how we go forward, the key thing for me would be that we have to take on board the views and the lived experience of those who are directly affected. The Women and Equalities Committee have done that. They did a report on transgender equality in 2016. They recommended a different option for gender recording on passports with an X. They also suggested that consideration could be given to removal of gender from passports, and that the UK Government should move towards non-gendering official records as a general principle. And they also, in their report on the GRA in December last year, asked the Government to clarify what barriers are there that prevent it from allowing non-binary people to be legally recognised. So these are, I think, reasonable and valid questions, and that need to make sure that we have lived experience at the heart of these conversations, I think, can't be emphasised enough. I'd like to just conclude by talking about the fact that people who are non-binary, people who have a real stake in this kind of debate, have had experiences that I think nobody in this chamber would be comfortable with. People have been refused services. Their mental health is poorer than that of the rest of the population. They feel uncomfortable sharing their identity at work. They are never comfortable. More than half of the people that have been part of this survey in terms of the fact that they don't think their identity would be respected. And I think for that reason we need to do more. I'm very grateful that the Scottish Government recognises the need to do more and has such a strong commitment to improving non-binary equality, whether that be the need to end conversion practices, which I have to say is a real contrast to the extraordinary pantomime that the UK Government has got itself involved in over conversion practices, and the missing trans conversion support, which I think is really disappointing in terms of the Queen's speech. The Scottish Government is also committed to advancing equal access to healthcare for LGBTI people, and will also continue to use the ILGA Rainbow Index as a benchmark for action. In contrast to that, the Government Equalities Office published in 2018 an LGBT action plan, and at that point they said they'd issue a call for evidence on the issues faced by non-binary people. But unless the Minister wants to correct me, I don't think that that's been published, and I think we need to understand why. My friend, the member for Aberdeen North, spoke about these issues in February this year and noted that none of the UK Government proposals she's seen sometimes even acknowledge the identity or existence of non-binary people, and that has to change, and I think that she's absolutely right in that. So that focus that the Scottish Government has on doing more, on appreciating that even when there are positives like the working group on non-binary equality that the Scottish Government has put into place, including the lived experience and the voices of non-binary people, that more still needs to be done. And that's for reasons of fairness, for reasons of well-being, and for reasons of the good of all of us. And I'd be keen to hear from the Minister on all of these points that I've raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Roger, and it's a pleasure to rise to speak in this debate with you in the Chair. And I'm also, of course, very grateful to the petitioners and also to the Honourable Member for Don Valley for opening this debate as well. Of course, this discussion has been of acute interest and importance to those people who themselves identify as non-binary. It's important also to be sensitive to the needs of those who would describe themselves as intersex or as having differences in sex development, whether they understand and would describe themselves as male, female or non-binary, and to understand the differences in terminology when we discuss these issues. Everyone is different, and that's why it's essential that in discussing these matters we do so in an atmosphere of respect, care and compassion. We will only find solutions by working together. Now, the background has already been set out. The Conservative Government maintains that it would reform the Gender Recognition Act. However, it is only determined to reduce the fee and put the process online. And we have not seen progress around, for example, removing the spousal consent provision, something we discussed in this chamber not so long ago. One of the elements where the Women and Equality Select Committee and many respondents to the government's call for evidence called for change was around non-binary people. Now, the fundamental value of importance for Labour when examining these issues is that of respect. We recognise the abuse that many non-binary identifying people have been subjected to, something rightly referred to by the petitioners. We also recognise that this is a particularly visceral matter for those non-binary identifying people who may also describe themselves as biologically intersex or as having differences in sex development, as I will come on to later. And again, I appreciate that these categories are not used by everyone. Labour has been clear that we must have far stronger measures against hate crimes to which LGBT plus people are subject and treat them as aggravated offences. That's surely necessary, given what appears to have been a doubling in reports of such appalling behaviour over the last 5 years. And I have to say that is an area where I would depart from the comments of the Right Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham and the Honourable Member for Don Valley. We believe there does need to be a change in the law to treat those offences as aggravated, as well as those offences against disabled people who are also not protected in that way. We also need to acknowledge that, of course, sex continues to play an important role in different areas of policy, as well as gender. As I have repeatedly made clear in my role as Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities, sex is not the same thing as gender. Both are important in different contexts, and that difference is reflected in legislation. I, for example, as a woman, am an adult female, that's my biological sex. There are, of course, also trans women who've made a transition in their gender, and they deserve respect and dignity also. Yes, happy to.
Just like to ask the Honourable Member, would she be happy with a trans woman entering the changing rooms and sharing these facilities with her? That's all I'm asking.
Thank you, Sir Roger. It's a slightly different question, I suppose, to that which I was discussing at that moment. I'm sure I hope the Honourable Member is aware of the fact that the EHRC has recently released some guidelines around these matters. I have to say, I may well already have shared such a changing room. Very often, women's changing rooms will have separate cubicles. In any case, that's the way in which people very often would be trying on clothes in those separate changing rooms in any case. But if he has interest in that matter, then he could look at the HRC's guidelines. Now, in the spirit of what I've just said, we as Labour urge the government to focus on the treatment of non-binary people, especially on the need for research into this. The member for East Renfrewshire referred to the fact that the government's LGBT Action Plan of 2018 committed the Conservatives to launch separate calls for evidence on the issues faced by non-binary and by intersex people. And the government appeared even to have contracted the National Institute for Social Research to investigate this area. However, no research actually appears to have been carried out. The HRC has also, and I quote, recommended that further understanding is needed in that context before any legislation might be brought forward. We believe that additional research is particularly important when it comes to those people who might describe themselves as intersex or as having differences in sex development. The relatively small number of individuals who are born with any of several variations in biological sex characteristics, such as, for example, their chromosomes or genitals, some of whom may describe themselves as intersex, and some of whom may describe themselves as non-binary. And I appreciate, again, not everybody does use those macategories. And I think few of us could fail to be moved. Yes, I'm happy to give way.
You're very generous with the time, making a very measured speech. And I've been listening carefully. And what she says about intersex or disorder of development is very important. But we must be so clear not to conflate what are genetic disorders with gender identity. They are two extremely different things. People who are born intersex do have a sex on their birth certificate. They are and should be cared for very closely medically, but that is a very different thing to gender identity, which is something for which there is no biological marker at all, and that is the subject of today's debate.
Thank you, Sir Roger. Well, I most certainly have not conflated the two. I would have thought that was quite clear from my comments, that I'm not conflating the two. In fact, I've been very explicit about the difference. And in fact, I have to say this matter did come up earlier in the debate, because a suggestion was made, unless I misheard him, from the Honourable Member for Don Valley, who seemed to suggest that it would be doctors who might take some of the decisions if there are those instances of differences in sex development. Now, there has been a very significant discussion around this, as I'm sure the Honourable Lady is aware, and in countries like Germany, for example, there has been quite a bit of work done on how it might be possible to ensure that actually at the age of medical consent and competence, those individuals might be better able to take decisions for themselves, obviously when that's still a healthy thing for them. In some cases, actually, those particular biological characteristics might be aligned with, potentially physical health problems, and therefore intervention is required earlier. But I mention it particularly because her colleague mentioned it earlier. And I think we do need to have more research around the prevalence of these matters, surely, in the UK, because we do not have much data around this. Now, of course, these discussions are taking place in a context where government has rolled back on the previous commitment to adopt a ban on conversion therapy, which would cover trans people. Now, let me be crystal clear. Such a ban must not cover psychological support and treatment, non-directive counselling, or the pastoral relationship between teachers and pupils and religious leaders and their worshippers, nor, it goes without saying, should it cover discussions within families. Indeed, the interim CAS review has made very clear that there is a disturbing lack of support and healthcare for children and young people with gender dysphoria, especially when that is accompanied by an additional diagnosis requiring care. And of course, that is in common, I regret to say, with the lack of treatment for children and young people in general in this country currently, with waiting lists spiralling out of control in many cases. Now, a ban on conversion therapy covering trans people would prevent what the British Medical Association and the mental health charity Mind have intimated is psychologically damaging abuse. It seems to me that only this current government could be spending time arguing over whether a form of abuse should or should not be banned, rather than supporting people in their daily lives. It would surely also be helpful for government to explain in more detail their understanding of barriers to altering current legal categories around gender and, separately, sex, given the frequent and unfortunate elision of both concepts. We need to understand the complex practical consequences to which the government has referred. The government has stated, in response to calls from those arguing for a non-binary category within passports, that a coherent approach needs to be maintained across government. However, it has not so far fully explained why some forms of documentation appear not to indicate whether the holder is male or female. Surely additional research and transparency from government is needed here, not least to explain their reasoning in these cases. Useful learning can surely be drawn from the different ways in which comparable nations have approached these issues. And I have to say, I think it's a symbol of maturity and strength of our country that we are able to compare our public policies with those of other countries, either to learn positive or indeed negative lessons. I think that's something positive rather than a negative. We must also do more, surely, and finally, to tackle gender stereotypes in the very first place. And I have to say, as a convinced feminist, I so often feel currently that we have moved backwards rather than forwards in that regard.
Hear, hear.
Care work, jobs in catering and in the creative industries are for boys and men, just as they are for girls and women. Jobs in manufacturing and science using hard maths, dare I say it, are for girls and women, just as they are for boys and men, and of course, all should be open to non-binary people too. We need to be eliminating gender stereotypes, and that includes those based on body image. And I agree with the Right Honourable Member for East Worthing and Shoreham in that regard. Above all, we need to make sure everyone in our country can reach their full potential, and that cannot be the case when we have such a degree of gender stereotyping. As mentioned, the key value for Labour in considering these issues is that of respect. Issues of sex and gender are highly emotive for understandable reasons. They're fundamental to people's sense of self as well as so much else, and that includes for people who identify as non-binary. So, Sir Roger, in ending, I want to reverse John Major's adage. When we come from different viewpoints on these issues, we surely need to condemn each other less and understand each other more.
Minister.
Thank you, Sir Roger, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. And I thank the honourable friend, the member for Don Valley, for sponsoring the debate. I would like to put on record that since I took up the role of Equalities Minister, I have always sought to ensure that the tone is respectful. People have a right to disagree, and they have a right to hold views and express them firmly without being cancelled, as colleagues have said. But I also wanted to put on record that pursuing someone's rights does not mean taking someone else's rights away. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And I'm sure that as we pursue what are thorny topics, we can seek agreement and some common ground. Because I genuinely do believe that the United Kingdom is a diverse society with many different cultures, backgrounds, identities and perspectives. And that diversity, in my view, is a source of strength and enrichment of our culture, and actually is a driving force for change and growth. So much of what makes our United Kingdom great is its very diversity and its embracement, if that's the correct word, embracing of, coming up with new words here, embracing new cultures, new peoples, and dare I say it, new ways of looking at people's sexuality and gender. And that diversity has started from simple things. Well, it wasn't simple at the time, but the 1957 Wolfenden Report on the decriminalisation of homosexuality to the full recognition of same-sex marriage across all 4 nations of the UK. And I also, of course...
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way and really meant to mention this earlier, but I wonder if colleagues would agree with me that the decision by the Church of Scotland today in relation to equal marriage is very welcome and one that we should all applaud.
All converts to equal marriage should be welcomed. I think even my honourable friend, the member for East Worthing and Shoreham, he and I sparred over the debate on equal marriage. And now I'm delighted to see that not only do we agree on equal marriage, but also we agree on civil partnerships for opposite-sex couples. It's amazing how things sometimes come full circle.
The Minister is indeed right. We didn't spar over equal marriage. We actually sparred over the same-sex marriage bill, which had many deficiencies at the time. The principle of same-sex marriage I've never had a problem with, and was very happy to be one of the sponsors of extending that measure to Northern Ireland, as has just happened, late in the day though it may be.
Thank you, Sir Roger. I stand corrected. But I also wanted to put on record that the government has no plans to change the Gender Recognition Act, nor do we have an appetite to change the Equality Act. And the provisions in those acts will remain. But I do want to also stress that the journey of LGBT equality has been debated, as I've mentioned, with rigour, and those debates haven't always been respectful, but I do think we need to ensure that we do make sure that people feel the right to disagree, but equally feel the right to debate those points forcefully where necessary. But I do think that sometimes, we do feel that change can be too slow. Those who want more change are always hungrier for speed. Those who are less sure of the change are often take some convincing or seek to stop that change. And I understand that. And I do believe that is where we are today. You know, the issue of non-binary people is an emerging focus of LGBT equality. And whilst to many people, non-binary identities are familiar and understood, to others they are much newer and raise questions that challenge the traditional notions of gender. Interestingly, throughout history, there have always been individuals across many cultures with different experiences and identities. Many of them go back thousands of years. Some of the identities that we are debating today have been with us for thousands of years. They are not a new phenomenon driven by TikTok. Some of them go back literally 2,000 years or more. And so today, as in the past, people who identify under the non-binary umbrella are as diverse as any other group. They are of all ethnicities, sexualities, backgrounds and ages, and their experiences will be unique, and the obstacles they encounter will be unique. And that is true, that what is true of one person's experience living as a non-binary individual may not be the same as another person's. And it is those experiences, this information and that data that the government is committed to examining and monitoring. Members have called for more data and more research, and that is exactly the position of the government. Because we must understand how, for non-binary people, everyday life is impacted by their identities, and exploring any obstacles they face that may require addressing in law. And that is exactly what specifically the Honourable Member for Oxford East supports. We do need more data, we do need to understand, because the data simply isn't there in sufficient quality. And so presently that information, as I've said, is lacking. And officials in the Equality Hub have conducted an analysis of existing data and research on non-binary identities, and have found it is not of sufficient quality to allow us to draw conclusions. And so the government will continue to monitor research into the experiences of non-binary people, seeking to better understand their lived experience. And if I may, Sir Roger, just turning on to the LGBT plan, which members have commented on or referred to, the government does remain committed to improving outcomes for LGBT people at home and abroad, and continues to explore opportunities in the areas of health, education and safety specifically. And I'm working across government with ministerial colleagues to develop tangible commitments that will improve the day-to-day lives of LGBT plus people in the UK. Of course.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for being so generous. I think that one of the things which would certainly improve the day-to-day experience of trans people would be if conversion therapy was banned for trans people as well as for the LGBT community. And I would be really grateful if the Minister could outline his views on the lack of that provision.
The Honourable Lady tempts me down a path which I have no views, apart from those. I have those views. The only views I have are the views of Her Majesty's Government, which are that at present the bill is proceeding whilst without the trans inclusion, whilst the government does further research onto the complexities. All I can say to the Honourable Lady, it's a work in progress, but I can't be tempted down that particular path at this stage. But I genuinely want to ensure, and I'm committed to ensure, that some of the day-to-day issues facing the LGBT plus people are addressed across government, and further details I hope to be able to discuss in the coming months. Members have referred to single-sex spaces, and the Honourable Member for Oxford East did talk about the guidance that has been issued by the EHCR, but also those members who took part in what I thought was a very good debate a few weeks ago in Westminster Hall. All sides of the debate agreed that clarity on the law, clarity of the rules around single-sex spaces was to be welcomed. And I think that that is a position that we are getting to. And it's important that the principle of being able to operate spaces reserved for women and girls is maintained. And that, I think, we all agree, that clarity is important. And if I could just turn on to prisons. There have been instances in the past, but I refer members to the answer given by my honourable friend, the Justice Minister, the member for South Suffolk, who made it abundantly clear that the rules were changed 3 years ago, And since that point, there have been no incidents in prisons. The issue of where a prisoner is placed is not down to where the prisoner what gender the prisoner identifies as. It is down to the offence of which they have been convicted, it is down to their physiology, it is down to their medication, and it is down to where they are on the trans journey. All of those factors form part of the risk assessment, and that is where the prison service decide, or how they come to a conclusion as to where to place the prisoner. It is simply not true that a prisoner can self-identify and place themselves in a prison of their choice. And I just wanted to touch, if I could, on the issue of trans people in single-sex spaces. For many years, trans people have used single-sex spaces in their gender without issue, and we have no interest in curtailing this. The law strikes the right balance, and we will not be changing it. And the newly published guidance does not change the legal position or the law. It simply seeks to provide clarity to providers on the existing legislation, and that will not change. If I could touch, Sir Roger, on the issue of trans adolescents and healthcare. It's important that under 18s are properly supported in line with their age and decision-making capabilities. And I want to be really clear that the Child and Adolescent Service, GIDS, does not provide any surgery to those under the age of 18 or permit any treatments that the NHS believe to be reversible. That is the NHS view. That is the government's position. If members believe that the NHS is prescribing puberty blockers inappropriately, that is a matter for the NHS, and members need to take that up. Of course.
Thank you very much for giving way. And I fully accept his comments that what's being done within the NHS anyway is within current guidelines. However, it is the case that there is no evidence for the use of puberty blockers in gender treatment. They have evidential base for other conditions, and that actually, whilst they may stop certain factors of puberty taking place, the act of going through puberty, the effects on brain density, brain development and bone density are not known at all, and these drugs are being used very much without the evidence that are required.
That may well be true, but I urge the honourable member to take that up with the Secretary of State for Health. This is a matter for the NHS. It is not a matter for me, and at the moment, the NHS is of the view that puberty blockers are reversible. But I also wanted to ensure that it is on record that the work of Dr. Hilary Cass, where she's published her interim report, is absolutely clear. Members have referred to the incidence of other factors that may cause gender distress, referring to things like neurodiversity. Dr. Cass is absolutely clear that it is the clinician's duty and their role, a protected right, if you like, to ensure that they explore all possible causes of gender distress. It is they will be protected. She will be issuing firmer guidance to ensure that clinicians understand their role, and their clients and the wider society understand their role, that it is the role of the clinician to explore all possible reasons for gender distress. That is a clarity that I think would be welcome from both the patient, but also the parents, from teachers, clinicians themselves, but also wider society. Of course.
He's making an interesting argument. He said quite rightly that the admission of puberty blockers is a decision to be made by the NHS. Capacity of minors is an issue for decision by government. And does he think that a 12-year-old has the capacity to opt into puberty blockers without the need for parental consent?
Minister.
Again, I'm going to have to stray into areas which I don't necessarily have the detail, because obviously the clinical operation of the clinic is a matter for the NHS. My understanding is that the under-18s cannot make those kind of decisions. I'm looking for guidance from officials in case I get this wrong. What I think probably safest to do to the my honourable friend is let me write to him with the specific details of clinical guidance of how under-18s are supported. My understanding is that an under 18 is not permitted to make an irreversible decision. The exact line as where that decision-making capacity with parental involvement, let me write to him so I make sure I don't want to get it wrong. Let me write to him so I get it absolutely right for him.
I'm grateful. That would be appreciated. I want to make sure he's writing to me on the right question, because he's just referred back to an opinion as to whether puberty blockers are reversible or not. My question, and what I want an assurance from him, because I think I know the answer, and I think he's inclined to give me a different answer, is that no child under the age of 18 should be able to opt into a puberty blocker form of treatment that's not required for medical or clinical reasons without the parental consent, unless there is a question mark over the capacity of the parental consent. This is about, does a 12-year-old have capacity to take what many of us would regard as life-transforming decisions without any reference to their parents, who retains that parental responsibility if that child does something wrong, at least until the age of 18.
Thank you, thank you, Roger. I'm not trying to give my honourable friend a different answer. I'm trying not to give him the wrong answer. And so what I will do is that I think the officials have got a very clear understanding of the question, and we will write with the details to ensure that that very specific question is answered. If I could just turn to sports, Sir Roger. My honourable friend, the member for Don Valley, raised the issue of participation in sports by trans and non-binary individuals. The government is clear that we support the independence of sports governing bodies to define their own rules on transgender inclusion. It's entirely appropriate that they can determine the right position for their own sport. Gender has no impact at all in some sports, even at elite levels, and for those where it does make a difference, the devil is always in the detail. And sports governing bodies are best placed to navigate this. We may have an opinion, but it is government's view, it is the sports bodies who are best placed to use all the available evidence to come up with their own policies of how to deal with trans sports people. Now, the Equality Act has permitted restrictions on the participation of transgender people in gender-affected sporting competitions in order to uphold fair and safe competition, and that's been in place since 2010. And again, the government has no intention of amending this provision. Now, in 2021, in September, the Sports Council's Equality Group published the Guidance for Trans Inclusion in Domestic Sport. The sports councils are currently working with a small number of sports to pilot some practical ways of using this guidance. And members, obviously, who wish to engage with that would be advised to contact the relevant sports councils so that they can understand what is being reviewed and their views can be expressed and taken into account. And the government believes that time should be given to the sports to consider this new guidance. But I would like to draw attention to the changing atmosphere for LGBT people in sports. Sport has traditionally proven a more challenging environment for some than for others to make themselves feel comfortable and safe to participate. That is not the same issue as where trans people are placed in sports. But it has begun to change in recent years. And only last week we were witness to the first male professional footballer in a UK club to come out as gay in over 30 years. And Jack Daniels, only 17 years old, has shown courage and maturity and authenticity in coming out publicly. And I hope that his coming out will encourage a more inclusive sport, because I can't believe for 1 minute he is the only gay footballer in professional sport. And certainly he's also been very honest in assessing the impact that he's likely to have on his, not just his career, but how he's reacted to by the fans. But he's now able to at least live his life the way he chooses to on his own terms. And I genuinely wish him the very best, and I hope that more follow his stance. So, to Roger, I just want to finish on an international point. The UK is and will always be committed to being a global leader in LGBT+ rights. We are by no means perfect, and we have work to do. But I also know that our role as co-chairs of the Equal Rights Coalition, and until this month, the European Governmental LGBTI Focal Points Network, are very important to us. I'm working with my colleagues like Lord Herbert, who is an envoy specifically on global matters. We will continue to work to address many of the issues that are facing us overseas, because many countries are further behind, and some of that is providing support, some of it is providing actual financial support to ensure that NGOs are able to challenge some discrimination. And so whilst we took the difficult decision to cancel the Safe to Me conference, I am grateful to all the stakeholders for the work that they did to get the conference almost to being in place. So I do want to ensure that at home we continue to build a consensus on the legal recognition of non-binary individuals, because that has not yet emerged, and we may not get to that consensus, and the government may get to the decision that it doesn't want to go down that route. But I do think that we need to have sufficient data, sufficient research, sufficient analysis, so that we are starting to make decisions on where we go with this particular issue based on the evidence. And so Roger, these issues are always thorny, never easy, and all I can say is that the government is willing to listen and to talk and to engage with many individuals so that their points of view are fully reflected in our policy development. Thank you.
Nick Fletcher to wind up the debate, please.
Thank you, Sir Roger. Well, I'd like to thank the petitioner for attending today. I hope you feel that you've had a good debate. I definitely feel as though it has been. I think it's the sort of debate that we need more of. I think it's been respectful of all people involved, and I do thank everyone for that. I do thank the Minister for clarification on the prisons issue. I think that's definitely been good to hear. And I would also like to be included in a letter regarding the puberty blockers to make sure that this is not, if we can confirm that this is not, these are not being given to under 18s without serious consideration. As regards to sport, the sporting world, I'm sure, will make its own mind up on that. But I do think it's something that desperately needs looking at before too long. So, as I said, thank you to everybody who's taken part in this. Thank all the people that I spoke to prior to this event, and I hope that the debate has shed some light for everybody involved. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 580220 relating to legal recognition of non-binary gender identities. Does many of that opinion say aye? Contrary, no? The ayes have it. Order, order. Next debate will commence at 6 o'clock.